Thanks for the intro. So my name is Thierry Leblond. I do research at EPFL in Switzerland. And this talk is going to be about enforcing the digital immunity of the International Committee of the Red Cross, or ICRC. To illustrate a couple of points I want to make at this point, this is a picture that we took while visiting a delegation of the ICRC that is based in an area bordering an armed conflict. So a specificity of the ICRC is that it operates in those kinds of areas, armed conflicts and other violent situations. It does pretty much so globally. It's active in around 80 countries as we speak. And to do so effectively in those very challenging environments, the ICRC benefits from privileges and immunities, or PNI. That brings us to the notion of digital immunity, which we define as computer security and privacy that is informed not only by technology, but also by organizational and legal factors. And so the point of this talk is really to understand what practical factors influence the use of this kind of technology in humanitarian organizations and others. And it becomes urgent to do so in the current context whereby data that is collected exclusively for humanitarian action is sometimes used to surveil both the staff and the beneficiaries of the ICRC, as illustrated in these news stories of malware attacks against field delegates, as well as this one whereby beneficiaries were targeted with military operations. So in this talk, I'll talk about the International Committee of the Red Cross, then I'll touch upon some methodology, results, and we will propose an architecture that, in our view, will improve the situation of the ICRC and other organizations. So the ICRC, from an organizational standpoint, was a 3-time Nobel Peace Prize recipient. The first time with Henri Dunant, who was the founder of the organization over 150 years ago, and then in each of the 2 world wars. Since its creation, the organization has grown dramatically to today employ over 16,000 employees working in those 80 delegations that I mentioned. It has a budget that's twice that of my institution, the EPFL, every year. And those characteristics enable the ICRC to operate in very challenging environments, such as armed conflicts. It is the only organization that visits detainees in Guantanamo's, that provides medical care to North Koreans, as well as provide physical forensics capability to the Mexican government. And so, as I mentioned briefly, to do so, the ICRC benefits from some legal backup incarnated by privileges and immunities. So those privileges and immunities are clauses in a bilateral agreement that is ratified by the ICRC as well as the states where the ICRC will operate. 2 of the most relevant privileges and immunities are the inviolability of premises, which makes it illegal for local authorities to enter ICRC premises in those states. So pretty much you can think of ICRC facilities as diplomatic embassies, as an equivalent, and as well as freedom of communications for ICRC staff at least. So in those environments, the ICRC staff can use end-to-end encryption, strong anonymity, and in principle, their communication should be immune to censorship. So to give you a sense of how those PNI compare with other organizations, you can look at this table. At the top, you have NGOs, like Médecins Sans Frontières, that typically do not benefit from any PNI. International organizations, like the United Nations, do benefit from some PNI. And the ICRC is the only organization that benefits from the privilege of non-disclosure, which means that it cannot be legally compelled to disclose humanitarian data to the authorities. And so, of course, that makes it a very attractive target for extrajudicial access by authorities and other parties to the conflict. So our methodology is as follows. We used an inductive approach, which means that we started with a set of theories that we refine as we collected more data. We use a set of qualitative tools, the primary one being semi-structured interviews, complemented with a survey to gain more qualitative information, as well as the review of internal documents and a field trip to an ICRC delegation bordering on conflict that, as I mentioned initially. We carried out 27 interviews until we reached topic exhaustion, which is one of a requirement of those types of qualitative studies, and combined the experience of the field workers that we interviewed amounted to over 250,000 of experience at the ICRC, more if we were to include experience gained outside the ICRC in other humanitarian organizations. So this is a summary of the characteristics of our interviewees. There are 27 of them. They span pretty much all the operational units of the ICRC. That means that are in contact with the beneficiaries. So we have data protection, economic security, forensics, health, also ICT, protection of civilian, restoration of familiar links, visit of detainees, water and habitat, and weapon contamination. The third column to the left represents the region where the participants were active at the time of the interview. Those regions are rotated every 9 to 24 months, so we cover more geographical diversity than what is shown on this table. And most interviews were carried out in English and lasted between 45 and 60 minutes. So going back to the geographical diversity of our participants, here you can see the red circles represented where our participants operated, and the blue ones, all the other delegations of the ICRC as of today. So it's an organization that spans pretty much all areas of armed conflicts, and we had a good visibility of the practices in different delegations. So now we're going to get to the results. We will talk about the data that is being collected by the ICRC, then see how this data is processed by the organization to provide humanitarian aid. And we will talk about also operational and legal factors that influence those data flows. So starting with the data, at the top you have units that provide goods to the beneficiaries that are called the assistance unit. And at the bottom you have the protection units that deal with services typically. There are three trends that you can see here. First, most units, both in assistance and protection, collect very personal data, as well as full names, medical data. The two units at the bottom of the assistance collect infrastructural data, which might also be sensitive when we deal with, say, unexploded ordnance that might reveal how warfare is being conducted by certain countries. And finally, the units dealing with services, so for example, the visit of detainees in prisons, also collect IHL data, or international humanitarian law data, that might contain violation by the authorities. So when reasoning about the sensitivity of the data, the interviewees referred to who would be the most affected by an unauthorized data leakage. The beneficiaries could undergo retribution, for example, if their criticism of the authorities were to be leaked. The ICRC could also experience loss of trust in the area where the data was leaked, or even globally, depending on the type of data leakage. And governments could also suffer at the diplomatic level of a data leakage of ICRC data. So now we're going to get to the data flows. And when we started this work, we expected data to be similar to journalistic organizations, whereby you have an anonymous source that is interested to disclose some data to one or a few journalists, so pretty simple flow, with 2 nodes and 1 edge between them. It turns out that in each of those delegations, the flows of the ICRC are much more complex than in most organizations. To the left, you have the collection. So on the horizontal dimension, you see the different stages involved in processing humanitarian data with collection, digitization, storage, management, and destruction. And on the vertical dimension, you see the different types of units of the ICRC. The red flows correspond to those that are not covered by privileges and immunity, as I will describe in a second, and the green ones, those that are covered by privileges and immunity. Now we're going to get into the factors that influence the structure of those data flows. So this is the organizational structure of the ICRC in all the delegations that you've seen. To the left, you have the field where data is collected and digitized, either directly by field workers or by going to a hospital where medical care is provided and data, as a result, is also being collected. In the middle, there is aggregation done in ICRC facilities that can be delegations or sub-delegations for large countries that typically benefit from the inviolability of premises that I mentioned, unlike the hospital that is represented in the field. And then finally, data is also aggregated and managed at the level at a global level in ICRC's headquarters that are based in Switzerland. So going back to the factors, we identified several practical factors based on the operations and the legality of ICRC's work. The first one is the vulnerability of beneficiaries. And so it marks a fundamental limitation of technology that in very adverse environments, technology might not be used by field workers. So for example, in a prison environment, you need to leave your electronic device at the entrance of the facility. And so the best that you can do in this case is to rely on paper forms and to pseudonymize and remove as much identifying information as you can. Then second is capacity building, whereby the ICRC staff must train staff that might not belong to the Red Cross or the ICRC in state-owned facilities like hospitals. And so in this process, sensitive information might need to be disclosed to staff that is more susceptible to coercion, either because they do not benefit from PNI, because they are nationals of the country where medical care is being provided, or simply because they are more susceptible to coercion. And another aspect of capacity building that weakens operational security is physical attacks, whereby infrastructure must be placed in facilities where data access or inviolability of premises is not present. And so with respect to technology, the need there is to build services that remain secure despite a partial compromise of its infrastructure. And finally, legal factors come into play, whereby data needs to be segregated per country, for example, and data sharings become problematic when data is stored in jurisdictions with asymmetric legislations. So to summarize what we've talked about so far, there are 3 main points. The first one is that data access should be granted to users that are carefully vetted based on their PNI, their citizenship, or generally their susceptibility to coercion. Second, operational security might be traded off based on various factors, and in particular when establishing secure communications between field workers and staff delegates, as well as when sharing data across asymmetric legislations. And finally, we need to complement those practical measures with technological ones that would strengthen the security posture of the organization. And this is what we're going to talk about now. So as I mentioned, in addition to our interview, we also conducted a survey, and this is the result of the satisfaction and the needs of field workers with respect to secure communication, data management, and processing. So what you see is that the need for security technology with respect to those three applications is uniformly high, as perceived by the delegates. However, the satisfaction is rather low. And to quickly browse at what might be the problem in the context of communication, typically secure communication applications lack end-to-end encryption. When they do employ end-to-end encryption, then they might exhibit metadata leakage, as is the case for Signal. So for example, ISPs, as well as the service providers and the cloud operator are exposed with the metadata of who communicates with or who is exchanging end-to-end encrypted messages over Signal. And finally, although field delegates do not have professional smartphones, they do often carry personal smartphones that lead to a large attack surface that they carry with them in the field. So in conclusion to the secure communication need, there is a need for a privacy-enhancing network that would provide those properties within the organization for communications between staff. So if you remember, this is the organizational structure with the factors influencing fieldwork. And so what we're proposing is to continue exploring the needs and the practices, as well as to propose training to field workers as we roll out new technology, to deploy, if you will, an organizational anonymity network that would provide end-to-end encryption, as well as metadata reduction to field workers, as well as to carefully place infrastructure in locations with different levels of trust to benefit the most trusted locations. And finally, we also envision to deploy an internal blockchain for access control that would benefit from the combined security and legal protection of different secure rooms located in different jurisdictions. And finally, processing to facilitate the sharing of data among those delegations. Okay, so that concludes my talk. We've seen that there was a strong need for new security technology that was tailored to the practicality of fieldwork. To close this gap, we will be continuing to collaborate with the ICRC and other humanitarian organizations to integrate the applications that they need into a usable platform. And finally, we envision to create a foundation in Switzerland that combines the perceived neutrality of academia with industrial capacity in order to deploy security technology in those organizations. I'll take any questions now if you have. Thank you.
Yes, I have a simple one, which may be very complicated. To what extent do you run into difficulties with international privacy laws that are different from one country to another, or is that not a problem?
No, I think it pertains to the legal factors that I was mentioning. So one good example is that at the moment there is an immigration crisis in Europe whereby migrants from the Northern Africa are trying to reach Western Europe. And so this migration crosses 30 different jurisdictions with different delegations, and data needs to be segregated legally in each of those delegations. But at the same time, in order to restore family links, this data needs to be correlated among those jurisdictions. And so there is a need for technology that would enable this use. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Hi, if I caught it correctly, I'm Joshua from OCI. If I caught it correctly, you recommended blockchain for room access. Blockchain is kind of a decentralized technology, so I guess how would blockchain or decentralized management help in this situation?
So so it's a proposed architecture. This is not something that we've started to work on yet. The benefit of blockchain, as I see it, is that it would enable to combine the operational security as well as the access control and the PNI of different server rooms located in different delegations, and it would enable to combine that. So, for example, when an access is granted to data, then it would be visible in all delegations that participated in granting this access. It would be very difficult for an adversary to remove data accesses. Now the adversary would need to compromise every single of those delegations that participate in the access.
Thanks.
We can do one more real quick question.
Hi, my name is Marmara from York University in Canada. So previously in your presentation, you stated that people who are working from the country that the ICRC branch is stationed in do not experience the PNI, the legal aspects of the PNI?
So it depends
Okay.
whether they're employed by the ICRC. So there are different categories of people, if you will, those that are employed by headquarters, those that are employed, so they do benefit from PNI, those that are employed by the delegation. And in general, those people are citizens of the country. And so what I meant is that they are more susceptible because, you know, their relatives and their ownership is based in the country. It's harder for them to leave the country if they are being coerced.
Would they be given any kind of immunity?
Yes, so they do benefit from PNI in principle, but
Okay.
it might be more difficult to use it
Enforce.
effectively. Yes,
Right.
and finally, there is a third category of people that would be those working for the Red Cross National Society, which is separate from the ICRC and typically does not benefit from PNI. It's an NGO that is subject to the laws of the local country.
Do you think this would make communication, like secure communication and such, a little bit complicated, like between those organizations and those individuals? Or would that not affect, really?
Yes, and so special care should be taken when the communication crosses an organizational boundary.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, let's thank the speaker again.